One of the most tender and meaningful stories in the Word is the calling of Samuel to become a prophet. And this is a story that many of us first heard as children. We picture Samuel lying in the temple at night, hearing his name called, running to Eli, and finally realizing that it is the Lord speaking to him. It is a beautiful story that invites us to reflect on how the Lord works in our lives, because the Lord has a calling for all of us. Now, not everybody gets the same calling, of course. Not all of us are meant to become prophets or leaders in a visible sense, but every single person has been created for a heavenly use in the Lord's kingdom. And one of the most important teachings of this story is that sometimes it takes a few tries before we realize what kind of life the Lord is leading us towards. Sometimes the Lord may speak to us many times before we finally understand what He is trying to say to us. The Lord may place something in our hearts over and over again before we finally stop and listen. And when we finally humble ourselves and say, "Lord, what do you have for me? I'm listening," we open ourselves up to be led into the life of usefulness that the Lord is preparing us for. The story of Samuel begins in a very interesting way. The story says that word from the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were infrequent. Israel had drifted away from the Lord. People no longer heard His messages the way they once had, and the sense of the Lord's presence felt distant to many of them. It probably seemed as though heaven itself had gone silent, and that feeling can be very familiar to us. There are times in our lives when we also experience spiritual silence, times when we pray and do not immediately feel any answers, times when we wonder where the Lord is, times when we feel spiritually lost, uncertain about our direction, or unsure about what the Lord may be calling us towards. Sometimes we look around at the world or even at our own life, and we ask ourselves, why does the Lord feel so far away? Why can't I see where He's leading me? Why does everything feel unclear? But the story of Samuel reminds us of something important. Just because the people of Israel couldn't hear the Lord did not mean that the Lord had abandoned His people. The Lord was still there the whole time. In fact, while people believed that the Lord had grown distant, the Lord was already preparing Samuel for an important use that would help guide Israel into a new chapter. Sometimes when we feel the most lost, the Lord is preparing something important for us. The Lord often does His deepest work beneath the surface before we can clearly recognize what He is doing for us. This passage from the book Divine Providence, which you can read in the back of your handout if you want to follow along, says that the human race throughout the whole world is under the Lord's supervision, and each one of us is being led by Him in the slightest details, from infancy to the end of life, with a particular place foreseen and provided for. Divine Providence is universal because it attends to the slightest details, and it is an infinite and eternal creation that the Lord has provided for Himself by creating the universe. We see nothing of this universal providence, and if we did see it, it would look to our sight like the scattered piles and random heaps that passers-by see when a house is being built. The Lord, though, sees a magnificent palace constantly under construction and constantly being enlarged. Think about that for a moment. We are being led by the Lord in the slightest details. Even during the times when people could not hear the Lord, He was guiding Samuel's life and leading him towards his calling as a prophet. And the same is true for us in our own lives. Even when we can't feel the presence of the Lord easily, he is still there, guiding us step by step towards a more useful and heavenly life. In the story, the moment that changed Samuel's life forever is deeply human and relatable in some way. The Lord called Samuel 3 times, and all 3 times Samuel misunderstood where the voice was coming from and went to his mentor Eli instead. And this is often how the Lord works with us too. The Lord calls us gently and repeatedly, but we do not always recognize his voice immediately. Sometimes the Lord places a calling on our hearts again and again until we finally get the message, such as a calling to become more involved with our church, a calling to help someone in our lives who is in need, or a calling towards a more meaningful and useful direction in life. But instead of recognizing the Lord's calling for us, oftentimes we ignore, misunderstand it, or explain it away. We tell ourselves, oh, that's just emotion, that's coincidence, that's just a passing thought. And yet, the feeling keeps returning because the Lord is infinitely patient. And he knows that sometimes it takes several tries before we finally answer his call. The Lord does not force himself upon us dramatically. Instead, he leads us gently, quietly, and repeatedly until we finally get the message he is trying to share. Now, if the Lord is constantly guiding us, then an important question arises: how does he actually reach us? Now, the writings explain something important about how that guidance often works. The book Secrets of Heaven says that the Lord is coming to a person constantly, bringing good to him, and also truth within that good. But the person either accepts this or does not accept it. If the person accepts it, all is well with him. But if he does not, all is ill. The Lord is always trying to guide us to our purpose, constantly bringing good into our lives. However, it is up to us to accept that goodness and allow ourselves to listen to his voice when he is leading us towards spiritual growth and heavenly use. Because otherwise, we may continue struggling to see more clearly the direction the Lord is leading us. The Lord does not shout normally. Usually his voice comes quietly through our conscience, through truth from the Word, or through opportunities in our lives to do good for our neighbors. We must learn to develop an internal willingness to listen for the voice of God in those moments and opportunities so that we may ask, Lord, what are you trying to teach me? What are you calling me towards? What kind of person are you leading me to become? And when we finally open ourselves up and listen, our path in life can become so much clearer thanks to the presence of the Lord in our lives. But as we all know, learning how to recognize the voice of the Lord calling us to our purpose is easier said than done. Sometimes we need extra help from somebody else in our lives to be able to recognize the way the Lord is leading us. And in the story, the priest Eli realized that it was the Lord who was calling Samuel. And once Eli finally got what was going on, he told Samuel, "Go, lie down, and if the Lord calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" And this is another beautiful part of the story because it shows very clearly that Samuel needed help recognizing the Lord's voice, and that is true for us too. The Lord often uses other people to help us recognize his calling for us, and we find those people in all areas of life. Parents, teachers, pastors, coaches, friends, mentors, grandparents. Sometimes another person sees the Lord working in our life and guiding us towards our true purpose before we see it ourselves. And Eli's role in this story is important because it shows us that we may need help in understanding the way that God is leading us in our lives, achieving our true potential. And there is nothing wrong with seeking guidance from people who have wisdom and spiritual experience. Once Samuel had that guidance from his mentor, he was able to respond to the calling of the Lord. The Lord called Samuel a fourth time, and finally, Samuel answered, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And that may be one of the most important sentences in the entire word. Because Samuel did not know what the Lord was going to say. He did not know the future. He did not know how difficult his calling would become. He did not know the responsibility that lay ahead. But Samuel was willing to listen and follow the path that the Lord has set for him. And that is how we can begin our journey towards becoming who the Lord created us to be. When we allow ourselves to have a humble heart, a teachable spirit, and openness to be led, even when we do not have all the answers, the Lord can work with us to take us where we are supposed to be. Psalm 25 expands on this beautiful attitude by saying, "Make me know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me." That is the spirit that Samuel had, and that we are supposed to emulate in our own lives. Teach me, lead me, I'm listening. This is the attitude that the Lord can work with. Not arrogance, not stubbornness, not self-certainty, but humility and a willingness to be led by the Lord. The writings teach very clearly in the book Last Judgment that people were created to become angels. And elsewhere in True Christian Religion, we learn that the purpose of creation was to provide for an angelic heaven from the human race. And what a remarkable statement that is. The Lord created every human life with heavenly potential. Every person has a place in the great design of the universe, and specifically every person has a unique heavenly use to fulfill. And the Lord is constantly calling us towards that usefulness. But again, we must be willing to listen, answer the call, and follow the path we must walk in order to fulfill the Lord's invitation for our life. Because the Lord will not walk the path for us. He will not force us to follow him. It is on us to answer the call. The book Divine Providence teaches us that it is a law of divine providence that a person should act from freedom according to reason. The Lord preserves our freedom. He treasures it. He will invite us. He will guide us. He will encourage us. He will call us. But he will not compel us to follow him. Samuel had to be willing to answer the call. And we must answer too. Maybe recently there are some of us who have been hearing a call from the Lord. Maybe not through a voice in our dreams, but through a feeling, an experience, or a conversation with someone in our lives. Maybe the Lord has been calling some of us towards a new path in life, towards usefulness, service, or spiritual renewal. Maybe the Lord has been trying to awaken something in us for years, and maybe today is the day to finally stop and listen. Because the most powerful part of Samuel's story is not only that God called him, it's that Samuel responded. Samuel responded to the calling by saying, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And that response changed the course of his life. It awakened him to the purpose that the Lord had been preparing him for, and led him down a path as a prophet that would not only benefit him, but the entirety of Israel for generations to come. So let us take his response as an example as we examine our own lives and the ways that the Lord may be leading us towards greater usefulness, love, and a spiritual life. When we listen for the voice of the Lord in our lives, let us reply to his calling by saying, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Amen.